Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm Andrew Schwartz with CSIS, and on behalf of CSIS and the TCU Schieffer School of Journalism, welcome to David Sanger's bar mitzvah.
We hope it ends well.
We're really privileged to have David here tonight, and my boss, John Hamry, and the #1 host on Sunday, Bob Schieffer. Let's give it up for Bob Schieffer.
Yes.
Bob, the floor is yours.
Well, I think you've written a bestseller here, David. This is one of the largest crowds that we've had for one of these this year. So if they buy books, they may just come to find out what's in it and go home. But
That's happened, Bob.
but they do. Yeah, but we all, and you all probably were like me, you thought we'd probably better hear what David has to say before they haul him off to jail here, because this book has really stirred up a lot of talk, both up on Capitol Hill and in the White House. Let me just start, David. I kind of always like to start with the news. What's the latest here?
Well, Bob, before we start, I just wanted to thank you
yeah.
and CSIS and John, you for having us all here. I wanted to thank some people out in the audience, starting with my wife, Cheryl, here. You know, when you write a book, you get to come up and talk to Bob Schieffer and to John, but Cheryl has been doing something really hard this past year. She's been teaching some of the neediest students at Anacostia High School, and she's really had an amazing year doing it, but it's a lot of hard work. And so we did a book and that all at the same time. So I wanted to thank her. My sons Andrew and Ned are here. Andrew headed off to Colorado College. My parents, Joan and Ken Sanger. My sister, Ellen.
Let people say who you are. We want to say hello to the
Okay.
folks here.
Just watch Andrew and Ned, you guys just all stand, right? And most important for the purposes of the book, Bob, as you know, I'm incapable of like organizing my sock drawer, much less writing a book in the course of a year. So we had some terrific, I had the luck of some terrific assistants. And you accused me before of actually not writing a word of the book. That's not true. I did at least the acknowledgments, right? But just to do a few more, Afreen Actor, who is here. Afreen, raise your hand. And June Torbati, there's June, and Samantha Pitts-Kiefer, and Jessica Harrison is here, and Lauren Barr. And someplace is Tim Maurer. Tim, where did you go? Well,
was he your
Tim
diversity candidate?
He was our diversity candidate. And
there's all these beautiful women.
That's right. That's right. So, so I just wanted to thank them all because, frankly, without their work, I'd still be on chapter 3.
That's good.
So what's the news? Well, as you say, the book has made a little bit of news for the Iran revelations, and that is the story of Olympic Games. I'm sure we'll get into it later on, which is a somewhat remarkable operation that the Bush administration started and the President Obama doubled down on to try to get at and have another way to get at the Iranian nuclear facilities. But there's a lot more in this book. This book tells the story of the president's journey on Afghanistan and Pakistan. It talks about the rise of China and what the administration learned along the way. It talks about the Arab Spring and how it took the administration by surprise and how they responded to it. Part of the fun that we had with some of the researchers was going a year after the Arab Spring to poke around the Middle East and see what that looked like. And it deals, of course, with how they've handled Iran, North Korea, some of the other troublesome areas. But it seems like most of the headlines were about 1 or 2 chapters, which is fine too.
Well, let me just ask you about that because to bring everybody up to speed on what's going on, as you probably know, we have now had the Attorney General has named 2 U.S. attorneys to investigate where the leaks that came in this book and also a book written by Dan Kleidman over at Newsweek came from. John McCain on Capitol Hill again today was saying that's not enough. He wants an independent counsel to investigate where these leaks came from. Can I ask you, David, has anybody contacted you yet?
So far all I've been hearing is from reviewers. And the way these things unfold, you never know what it is exactly they're going to look for. But only in Washington, Bob, would you come out with a book that describes the interesting policy issue, and I think there was a great public interest in laying out the fact that the United States is using cyber weapons. Of course, the U.S. had said before it was developing them, and it had never said before that it had made use of them. And there are lots of interesting questions about whether or not the U.S. should be using cyber weapons, whether it makes us more vulnerable to others. But only in D.C. would the only question be, how did that get out? And that is somewhat typical of Washington. But the most important fact to know here is it got out because of a mistake that we describe at the beginning, in the first pages of the book, that a programming error that allowed the entire worm that they had designed to leap aboard the laptop computer of an Iranian scientist, who then left the Natanz enrichment plant, I guess went home, plugged into the internet, and it spread around the world. And at that moment, the Iranians knew that, this was 2010, that somebody had designed a cyber weapon. They seemed to, at the time, express some suspicions about who that somebody would be. And so that was the string we pulled on. But the thought here that it's news to the Iranians that they were attacked by a cyber weapon, that's a little bit wild. The Iranians knew it.
Did you were on Face the Nation. You and Dan Kleinman both were on Face the Nation. And what struck me this week is when President Obama came out and said, these authors have assured me that this information did not come from the White House. I don't remember you saying that. Did you say that the information did not come from the White House?
No, I think what I said on Face the Nation was that this was an 18-month-long project, that I worked from the bottom up and started with the leak of that worm out of Natanz. The phrase leaks for the rest of it, I think, doesn't really sort of do justice to the process of building a book. You talk to many, many people in many different countries, and you try to assemble as best you can the story of what has happened. But I don't think that we have said anything about what groups of people we spoke to or didn't speak to or whatever.
Dr. Hemry, you've been in Washington a long time, like me. You've been through leaks investigations. What do you make of the uproar over this book?
Well, I must confess, and I said this to David, that, if I'd been in government, I'd be pretty unhappy, because you do operate important actions that need to be kept in secret, and when some things come out, it's an awkward moment. But the underlying policy question, should we use a wider range of tools to try to influence other countries, it's obscured by this debate over where the leak came from. And I think the fundamental question we'll get to once we get through the drama of the leak is really that. What do we think about these sorts of tools? Did we create more danger to ourselves by doing this? That's in one sense the debate that we should be having, rather than this who shot John. I've started a lot of investigations myself. They never end up well for the government, So I think it's probably going to be a fruitless exercise to pursue that. We really ought to be getting to the larger policy question.
Well, let's talk about some of that. David, one of the things you talk about in the book is what you think the Obama doctrine is. What is it?
Well, President Obama doesn't want to talk about having a doctrine, and I wouldn't blame him, because anytime a president comes out and says they have a doctrine, people like me walk along and try to figure out whether or not an individual action fits in the doctrine, violates the doctrine. You're asking all these questions. So, Dr. Hamre's been great about writing about doctrines since he got here, but I bet you didn't like doing it when you were in the Defense Department. Right? If I had to say what I thought the two big elements of the Obama doctrine are, they are as follows. First, President Obama is clearly willing to go use unilateral force when he believes there is a direct threat to the United States. So the bin Laden raid is an example. The use of drones over Pakistan, another issue that I think they were concerned on leaks, not because of the book, but because of articles that have appeared in the Times and Mr. Kleidman's book, as we described, in the so-called kill lists. And you see it in Olympic Games. You see there a willingness to go into the violate the sovereignty of another country in the purpose of trying to eliminate something that the president believes could be a direct threat. What those have in common is that they're all light footprint kind of examples. In other words, the president sort of decided that the era of sending 100,000 troops for spending $1 trillion over 10 years to try to change societies that may or may not be willing to change and that certainly resent our presence, that day is over. And so he needs some kind of tool to be able to deal with these issues, and the tool he has chosen are these. The other side of the doctrine, though, is that when the threat is not a direct one to the United States, when the threat is sort of a general concern, Syria, Libya, his main objective is to make sure that other countries that may have an equal or greater direct threat put some skin in the game. That the United States not always act as the policeman of the world, and that we wouldn't act until others also go in. And that was the whole message of Libya. And of course, in Libya, the NATO forces were ostensibly in the lead. They also ran out of ammunition, always annoying when that happens. And the U.S. had to go in and sort of resupply. So at moments it has been difficult. Syria is an example where it's been really difficult because everybody's been frozen by the fact that the United States isn't willing to go in by itself and others are resistant, including the Russians. I was at a luncheon today where Secretary Clinton said that attack helicopters were coming in support of the Syrian government. She seemed to suggest they were from Russia. That seemed newsworthy to me. She didn't quite say they were Russian attack helicopters, but she immediately went on to discuss Russia and her concerns about them.
They're coming in on the side of...
They're coming in presumably on the side of the Syrian government. She was clearly concerned about this. And so these are all examples of cases where the United States has found that the doctrine has run into some limits.
Who makes the
But
foreign...
can I just say,
go ahead.
I can't imagine any president that wouldn't embrace those two principles. I mean, if it's really serious, we're going to do it no matter what. And we're always trying to find somebody else to do stuff we don't care about. I mean, we didn't go into Rwanda. A lot of people feel we should have gone into Rwanda, but we just didn't. We didn't go into the Congo. We helped other countries go into the Congo. We didn't go into the Central African Republic. We helped the French get it. I mean, in one sense,
give you one example, John. Though I think the president's team would probably say, if they were speaking about this doctrine, that Iraq was a case where, in their minds, it didn't pose a direct threat to the United States, and we did take the lead to go in.
Well, like every president seems to define themselves about what they didn't like about their predecessor.
Sure.
And that's in much the quality of this. But in some sense, they're quite similar because both of them wanted to demonstrate a unique new way to accomplish a national goal.
I would agree with that.
Without really having a strategic frame of reference for either of them.
Who makes the foreign policy decisions in this White House, David?
What strike?
Who makes the foreign policy decisions in this White House?
What struck me in the reporting for Confront and Conceal is that when the president first came in, he cast a very wide net on foreign policy decisions. And here, think about those photographs we saw when they were deciding on the Afghan surge. And there were 8 or 9 meetings in the Situation Room. They invited in almost, everybody in the U.S. government who had an interest in it. There were days when there were briefings on the Pakistani nuclear threat. There were days when there were budget concern briefings. There were briefings on the Taliban, and you'd get these photographs released. It was a very crowded sit room, it turned out to be a very leaky sit room as well at the time, and so there were a lot of news reports about what went on in those meetings. Fast forward 1 year, when the president had to decide how fast troops were going to come back out. No sit room meetings that we saw pictures of anyway. A very small group of 5 or 6 officials. Tom Donilon, the National Security Advisor by that time, Dennis McDonough, his deputy and a very long time aide to the president. Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates at that time, but even in that decision, they appear to have been brought in relatively late in the process. Vice President Biden, for sure, who had lost the first round but sort of won the second round here. And in the case of Afghanistan and Pakistan, the advisor for Afghanistan and Pakistan, General Douglas Lute, Lieutenant General Douglas Lute. But the group appeared to have gotten very, very narrow. And I would say that in the decisions that have followed, it has stayed narrow.
Let's talk a little bit about China. You brought out a very interesting point in the book. You talk about how the Chinese interpreted President Obama's willingness in the beginning to engage them as weakness. And I guess the question is, how long did it take the White House to figure that out, and did they change their strategy?
They did change their strategy, and it took about a year. The beginning of the administration, we saw an effort to bring the Chinese in basically as equals, at least on the subject of economic management. And so there was a meeting in London, you may recall, it was the first big meeting of the G20 that was supposed to deal with the financial crisis. And President Obama met with Hu Jintao. I think it was their first meeting as presidents. And there was discussion of a G2, that the world's first and second largest economies would solve these problems themselves. The Europeans and the Japanese weren't really in love with that phrase. But the concept was that the two big economic superpowers would be in charge. As the year wore on, it became increasingly evident to the administration that that was, in fact, regarded as a sign of weakness. And by 2010, of course, you saw the Chinese beginning to stake claims down in the South China Sea, declaring that certain islands were their territory, and so forth. And when that happened, you began to see the administration push back a bit. And that accelerated in 2011 and led to what the administration briefly called the pivot, until the Europeans asked the question, what are you pivoting away from? Us, right? So they changed it to rebalancing. But that was certainly an effort to try to push back, put some limits, almost an electric fence around where the Chinese were going to go. Whether that works, whether you can do that without making the Chinese feel as if they are being contained, is really an open question.
But I think, in fairness, the first year of the presidency, there weren't confrontational issues with the Chinese, but there were in the second year. There were 5 or 6 episodes at sea where we had some brushing up against each other in the South China Sea. They were our reconnaissance activities, and the Chinese responded. I think we would miss the story without recognizing there were two sides in this. I think the so-called change in the Obama administration's attitude really in some measure was responding to challenges. At one point, we sent a destroyer, to be there to make sure that there wouldn't be a follow-up incident. So it partly was a change in thinking on the part of the Obama administration. It also was a change in behavior that we had to deal with.
Dr. Hamre, how would you rate this administration and how it's dealt with foreign policy thus far?
This country is tearing itself apart in this election, but it's about domestic policy, not foreign policy. I mean, there's a fairly strong consensus on our foreign policy. That the president has, I believe, carried out his initiatives fully, consistently in the mainstream of American foreign and security policy. Stood up firmly in Asia when that was called for. He followed through in Iraq. There are some people question that he pulled out too quickly in Iraq, but that's not controversial with Americans, maybe with the military, but not average citizens. He did surge more forces into Afghanistan beyond what President Bush had put in. This is a very traditional, and I would argue centrist, foreign policy, and as a result, there's not great controversy about it. I mean, it's controversy over this. Did they leak documents to make them look bigger and brighter and shinier than they are? I mean, but it's not about the content of the policy.
Would you agree with that, David?
I've seen a little bit on content, but it may not be for real. So Governor Romney, in the course of getting his way through the primaries, seemed to take positions that were significantly to the right of even where many of his, not all of his, but many of his advisors were. So take Afghanistan, for example. When the news came out that the United States was conducting negotiations with the Taliban, no surprise to anybody in this room, it's been an effort they've been trying to get going for, what, a year and a half, 2 years now. You heard Governor Romney say he wouldn't negotiate with the Taliban. He would defeat the Taliban. And that left actually some of his own advisors asking the question, well, how long would that take? We've already been there 10 or 11 years. How many more troops would that take? And you haven't heard him repeat that since. You have also heard him make the argument that the United States has backed away from global leadership. And I think that gets to that second element in the Obama doctrine that I was talking about.
Leading from behind.
The concept of leading from behind, not my favorite phrase, but I think one that is somewhat telling, is one that the United States should not be involved in. But then when you ask the specific of what would you do differently? Would you go into Syria with American troops unilaterally? You don't get a difference that sounds all that great. And Iran has been an area where Governor Romney has repeatedly said he thought the president had been weak.
But I think the one area, and you bring it out in your book, David, that I think is a substantial difference, and that was when President Obama implied a deadline for pulling out of Afghanistan. I think that's one that genuinely is a dividing point, and I think is an issue. Certainly the military community is apprehensive about that. It's probably dramatically circumscribed the diplomacy.
Right.
You talk about that again in the book, and that's probably the most important defining difference.
And it's not just the military that was concerned about it. There was a big debate within the administration. Secretary Clinton was uncomfortable with that as well, and expressed the opinion internally that it's fine to have a deadline for pulling out, but you might not want to announce it. And then there was this great moment when Henry Kissinger went in and went to visit the team that was negotiating with the Taliban, and he said, well, two things. Don't set a deadline, because if you do, they'll just wait you out. And the second thing he said was, once you begin withdrawing troops, it's like eating popcorn. You can't stop. And then he paused and said, especially in an election year.
You know, before I forget it, you have one chapter in the book that I found a little bit scary, really, but fascinating, called The Bomb Scare, that describes, there were a couple of days in 2009 when the administration actually thought that the Taliban had somehow gotten a hold of a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, this was a remarkable moment. There are bits and pieces of this that were reported prior to my book, so I don't want to take full credit for it, but I sort of dug down into it. It turned out that they believed the Pakistani Taliban had gotten either a weapon or the material for a dirty bomb. And this was based on a series of intercepts where, of course, they're translating out the conversations, and there's some question about whether or not they were hearing the translation right. Okay? So one possibility is they just got that wrong. The other possibility is the Taliban had bought something and been scammed by the Russians or someone else. That's happened before.
That's happened before.
Yeah. But in any case, there were 4 or 5 days when people were pretty much on edge, and the president actually dispatched a nuclear search team to the Gulf. They did not go into Pakistan. And then they asked the Pakistanis to go search around a bit too, which is sort of the polite way of saying, hey, could you guys check and see if anything's missing? You know? And they got back the report that nothing was missing, which was helpful. But they were a little bit disturbed by the fact that they discovered the Pakistanis didn't have a huge amount of technological depth in going off to search for this material. And it raised the question, if a Pakistani weapon ever did go missing, did they have the technology and the ability to find it with the speed you would need? And if you're wondering why it is that President Obama has decided on having an enduring force in Afghanistan, just over the border from Pakistan, partly it is, of course, to keep some stability in Afghanistan and to try to make sure Kabul doesn't fall, but partly it's in case what turned out to be a false alarm one day turns into something more serious.
But it is virtually impossible to find a device once it's gone missing. I mean, our search capacity is, we've got these Buck Rogers images. There's some satellite someplace that just beams in and homes in, and there it is, and it's that house. It isn't like that at all.
It works in the James Bond movies.
It's in the movies, but it is not real. And so overwhelmingly, our focus has to be on prophylactic action. Setting up the control structures in advance, setting up the permissive action, procedures in advance, so that you put as much preventative structure in place, because if one goes missing, it is, this idea of finding it is not a high
What is the likelihood that the Taliban could get their hands on?
Well, the Taliban is a subsidiary of the Pakistani ISI. The ISI is a subsidiary of the Pakistani Army. The Army runs the production complex, and they manufacture more weapons a year than any other country in the world, with the exception of Russia. This is not a good combination.
How many do they have? Is that
I don't
information?
think that there's a
No.
public number, but hundreds.
100. And are they big? The kind we call big ones? Are they tactical? What are they?
It's well beyond what I really know. They are, we don't know, but we do know that they are tactically relevant. I mean, in the sense that they're not giant things that take huge, complex delivery structures. They're meant to go on a missile, for example.
Just to add in on that point, because there's a little bit about this in Confront and Conceal, one of the concerns that the Obama administration has had is that as the Pakistanis improve their nuclear force and try to, of course, focus it more on India, they have moved to more very light, mobile, tactical nuclear weapons. Not unlike what we used to use, during the height of the Cold War, when we were concerned that the Soviets would come through the gap in Germany. And this is worrisome because small tactical weapons are easier to steal, and when they're on the road, they're easier for somebody to get at, and you're never quite sure of the loyalties of the Army unit that's moving around. So if you happen to have people who have particular Al-Qaeda or Taliban loyalties within that group, having a weapon that is small and movable is a lot more worrisome than having something that's stored away where the nuclear cores are one place and the triggers are someplace else. The other difficulty that we've had in this, and John makes the right point, it's always very difficult to figure out where these weapons are. It's particularly difficult because the Pakistanis are concerned about not telling us very much about them, because they're afraid the biggest threat to their arsenal isn't Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, but us. That there is always some U.S. group, SEAL team, right over the border. And that's why that RQ-170, the stealth surveillance plane that was over the Abbottabad complex during the bin Laden raid, was particularly upsetting to the Pakistanis, because they're thinking if they didn't see it hanging out over Abbottabad for hours on end, what are the chances they are going to see it hanging out over their nuclear complex?
Well,
Do
you
we
do-
know how many nuclear weapons they have? Do we?
We have I think a solid dialogue with them, but the precise, I would probably guess that the precise numbers are more our
Do we know
estimate.
where they are? Do we think?
I
we do?
don't know the answer to that. I don't think I should probably comment on that.
We know where some of them are, and that was part of the disturbing element of an attack on a Pakistani naval base that took place shortly after the bin Laden raid. You may remember there was a quite spectacular attack inside this naval base. It turned out that the base didn't have any nuclear weapons, but there were some nearby, and that got a lot of people's attention here.
You write about the Arab Spring. What was the, I guess, I don't know if exactly the word with this people, what was the administration's relationship to the Arab Spring? I mean, did we do much? Did we know much about it? Did it catch us totally off guard?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things that we had a chance to go report out for the book was that President Obama had been pretty unhappy with the quality of the intel he had been getting about the possibilities that these regimes were weak, false. So in the summer of 2010, he commissioned a presidential study directive, which was conducted inside the White House about the fragility of these regimes. Now, they didn't make it public at the time because for many of these regimes, you sort of don't want to advertise to them that you're studying whether or not they could collapse. It's a bad public relations move. But that study was well underway by the time the Arab Spring happened. And there's a scene in the book where Tunisia blew up, was obviously the first of the Arab Spring states to go. And the president is being briefed, and he asks the question, what are the chances that this is going to spread to Egypt? And the answer came, oh, very low, sir. That didn't last more than a couple of weeks. Then Egypt happened, and you'll see in the book a bit of a transcript from a remarkable conversation, the last conversation between President Mubarak and President Obama. And this was the phone call after President Obama had watched Mubarak on TV and realized he wasn't getting the message. After being told by his aides, you know, he's going to begin to step aside, he gave this very defiant speech. So the president called him. There had been a behind-the-scenes struggle within the Obama administration about whether or not to help push Mubarak out, with Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates saying, you know, you might not want to do this until you're sure who follows. And younger members of the administration who could sort of envision themselves out in Tahrir Square saying, no, you've got to get on the right side of history. And in this conversation, President Obama says, you know, sir, I respect my elders. You've been running the country for 30 years since I was in college, but maybe it's time to move on. And Mubarak says, give me 10 days. President Nasser put something like this down. And it was sort of code word for, in 10 days, I can shoot most of these people, and this whole thing will go away. And President Obama sort of pushes back and says, you know, I don't really think you understand what's going on in your own streets. And it was just this very poignant moment where you sort of see the rubber hit the road in the U.S. trying to ease an ally out. And I think Mubarak wouldn't have lasted whether the conversation took place or not, but it was just an interesting vision.
What is the big difference between Syria and Libya?
You want to take the first shot at that? Want to do the second?
Well,
And just take that as a launching pad.
Yeah.
well, first, Syria has a more competent military. You know, Libya was always a fairly incompetent military and a very small Praetorian Guard. You know, that was really so. That was an issue. I think second, this is a lot more complicated. There are a lot more things that get unhinged. I mean, if Libya failed, the consequences weren't necessarily broad, but here we're worried about the future of Lebanon, we're worried about the future of Jordan. You know, I mean, it's a very fragile, so it could spread much more widely. And so we got through Libya with luck. And I think the fear is that this is not, you can't count on luck as a strategy if you're going to do something like Syria. And at this stage, we'd rather not get out on front where we don't have core interests, or certainly humanitarian interests. I think it is a larger and more serious situation than we recognize here. And but it isn't compelling for anyone to want to put boots on the ground. And unlike the Libya operation, where Muammar Gaddafi had alienated all other Arab leaders, even though the Syrians have alienated themselves, the Arab League is not giving an endorsement for military action the way they did with Libya. So I think there are some substantial differences. It would be a heck of a problem if we had to do something.
What did you find out about it?
Well, you know, I thought Kofi Annan put it very well over the weekend when he said, you know, Libya people were pretty sure would implode. Syria people were pretty sure would explode. Mm-hmm. And so that's number one. Secondly, it's a reminder that geography still matters in foreign affairs. That in the case of Libya, we could see by satellite the Libyan troops moving across the desert, and there was a moment to go get them with aerial bombardment before they got off into the cities, and that really did a huge amount of damage to the Libyan military. In the case of Syria, they're already in the cities. This is a civil war that's underway. There's no way to conduct a bombing raid without having horrific civilian casualties. So you don't want to do it from the air. Going in on the ground has all of the problems that John described. And then you have the Russians. Fundamentally, you know, they don't love Assad, and I think they would agree to take Assad and move him out. But they feel as if the United States hoodwinked them in the case of Libya, that they passed a resolution and then used it to go well beyond the humanitarian mandate to force Gaddafi out. And they have vowed they will not let that happen again.
Question from the audience, right there.
Do we have microphones? We could raise it. Yeah, stand up and
Here comes the microphone.
there's a mic right here.
This is on regards to Olympic Games. Considering that China and Russia have their own cyber weapons capabilities, seems as well the United States had a lead, but just how much of that lead was lost with the leaking of the virus into the broader world?
You make a very good point. We're pretending here as if this is the early days of cyber weapons, and I guess in many ways it is. I mean, we're sort of the equivalent of where we were in nuclear weapons between, 1945 and, say, 1955. I mean, we're in the early stages. But so far, the cyber weapons that we have seen used against the United States have been pretty much computer on computer. In other words, a lot of people believe Chinese or Russians, others, come in to lurk around in American computer systems, maybe look for proprietary corporate data, a lot of that, try to get in at defense-related data, maybe airplane designs and so forth. There have been attacks on the Pentagon, on the Office of the Secretary of Defense. President Obama got a pretty big wake-up call when there was what's believed to be a Chinese effort to get into his campaign computers in 2008. And I think the same thing happened to Senator McCain at that time.
It did.
So at least they were equal opportunity. And then
Bipartisan.
What is that? And nonpartisan.
Nonpartisan.
Completely nonpartisan. And then, of course, there was the Google attack in 2009. But these have all been computer on computer. What made Olympic Games particularly fascinating was that this was one of the first sustained efforts we've seen. We've seen individual efforts before, to go through a computer system of another country to affect infrastructure, to make the centrifuges blow up. The concept of the worm was to go in and speed up or slow down the Iranian centrifuges and unbalance them, and thus make them explode. And these things are spinning at supersonic speeds, and if one blows up, you really don't want to be standing next to it. So that was the effort here. And I think one of the concerns is that our own infrastructure is, of course, vulnerable, whether it's the utility system or the cell phone system or the air traffic control system.
If I could just add just one little piece, I think what's important about this, this was a code. This is not like your internet stuff. I mean, there are things that are going against the internet every day. This was designed to go against a proprietary, unique operating system that's used in industrial processes. This code is used to run, I don't know what the percentage is, 20–30% of all the industrial plants in the world. I mean, it's, to run, chemical factories. So what is unusual and what's, I think, ominous about this is that it is a code that is fundamentally used widely in industry. And in the past, most cyber criminality, for example, would be try to break in, steal somebody's credit cards, and charge with it. This is a case where if you could get into a company's, the system that's running the chemical plant, and you can say, send me $100 million tomorrow or I destroy your plant. I mean, we have a whole new dimension of just criminality that's going to be in front of us because of this.
That's right. And there are some efforts to protect against that. I was out at a demonstration they did outside the Idaho National Labs where they have set up a sort of miniature chemical plant, and they attack it each day and try to see whether or not you can respond to it. And of course, in cyber attacks, the attacker has all of the advantages. In the one test that they showed to a group of reporters, in fact, the attackers won the day. Now, what they were concerned about at that time, Stuxnet was already out, had been discovered, this was just last year that they did this, was that elements of the Stuxnet worm that got out from Natanz are now available to people, and they can sort of see how they're structured, and it's a little bit like finding sort of loose ordnance around, and they could try to reformulate it and send it back at us.
Another question right here, yes.
So if we look at what's been happening both with what the United States, the policy that we've taken, what happened with the release of Olympic Games and then with bin Laden, there's this sense of, the Pentagon said about a year and a half ago, is we would respond in a cyber way to kinetic warfare. So if somebody came at us kinetically, we would respond in a cyber way, but only if that happened to us. What the Olympic Games showed is that we actually did this proactively. And there have been some tensions around what we did with bin Laden as far as we went in aggressively now with Olympic Games. So I have two questions to that. At what point does the international environment say, okay, enough from the US because you're taking actions and you've done this covertly? And what was the thought process from your perspective in understanding that, knowing this would eventually get out, but being the one to sort of release this out initially, understanding the secrecy and the confidentiality from a national security perspective?
Very good question. First, in the bin Laden raid, for example, there was no particular effort to cover up the fact that we were violating Pakistan's sovereignty. In fact, the White House said that President Obama had promised during the campaign that if he ever knew where bin Laden was, he would go into Pakistan to go get him. And the Pakistanis objected to that then, and of course objected when the raid happened. And a lot of the book deals with, or some chapters of the book, the question of how the bin Laden raid really poisoned the well in what was already a pretty rough relationship. And I think we'll be paying, we'll be playing that out for the next few years. Olympic Games is a little bit different because it demonstrates, as you say, that the United States is willing to go over sovereign boundaries to use cyber weapons. And in fact, the boundaries become very hard to define when it comes to cyber weapons because cyber attacks happen all over the world. And there is some belief that attacks that might begin in China or Russia or some other place end up being launched from a third country, and that's part of the difficulty. So part of the question, policy question it raises is, who is it, where is it that the United States is willing to go attack? To the question of my own decision process in this, here was what I sort of went through. The Iranians already knew they had been attacked by a cyber weapon, and they'd already announced who they thought had been the attackers. So I don't think I was giving news to the Iranians. The Times has the New York Times has a pretty set group of procedures in many national security stories, and we did these with WikiLeaks as well, where we go to the government and say, if there is something of importance here affecting operational security, someone's life, a future operation, let us know, and we'll try to take that into consideration. And it's reasonable to assume that in all stories of national security nature, you try to have that conversation. So the big question was, could you raise the policy issue that you've raised here and make it clear the United States has already sort of crossed this Rubicon, as I quote someone in the book as saying, without giving away operational secrets? And I hope I walked that line.
Where are we? Yeah, right here.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Alula from Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. Thank you for both of you to talk about what's going on in the Congo. So my question is there any agenda to stop the genocide in Congo? We lost more than 8 to 10 million people. And very recently, just Rwanda invaded the Congo again when looking for Bosco Tanganda, who is wanted by the International Criminal Court. It makes us believe that the rape of Congolese women and all those atrocity that is happening in Congo is part of U.S. business asset now. How do you see that, the hand of this situation? Thank you.
I don't know why you're looking at me. First of all, sir, I must confess to not be aware of this immediate issue that you've brought up. So I apologize for that. I'd be happy to get together with you and talk about it. I suspect that it is, I don't doubt that the people in the administration would be outraged by these actions. It's a case of probably that they've got so many things that they're working right now that it just doesn't rise to the level where they have to respond. But let me come and meet with you and learn more about it, and I'll see what I can do to help. Okay, thank you.
Did you want to say?
The only thing that I wanted to add here is you raise a question that I think the Obama administration is struggling with all humanitarian interventions, because after Libya, or mid-Libya, the president gave a very good speech, I think, that sort of laid out why the responsibility to protect is part of a mission for the United States, but one that has limits on it. And with Syria, we've discovered the limits. Chicago, we've discovered the limits, but we've discovered the limits in many places around the world. And I think this is an area where they're still sort of struggling to figure out what merits American intervention.
Well, and honestly, the Bush administration argued that going into Iraq was responsibility to protect.
That's right.
In this case, a larger world, not just so there's just cross currents to these issues that are very hard to resolve and don't naturally resolve themselves.
Okay. Any questions over here? Where? Way back there. Okay.
Christoph Marschall from the German daily Der Tagesspiegel. Thank you for your work, David. I just would like to follow up on the question before the Congo question. It was not only about the rules you try to obey when it comes to national security, it's also the question how the world reacts to this kind of American action. And there is a study, a Pew study coming out tomorrow. It's embargoed until midnight tonight, so it will be interesting to see the exact results. But you will not be surprised that probably the answer is the world don't like what they see. Most of your even allies don't like. They didn't like Guantanamo. They don't like unilateral action with Stuxnet. They don't like drone war, for example. The exact results you have to see tomorrow. My question now would be to follow up. Should the American government pay attention to that, and to which degree when it comes to this two different goals? We want to be secure. On the other hand, we are not living alone on this world. We have to rely on partners as well. And how does this affect our policy? Thank you.
Well, you know, I think you're raising one of the fascinating paradoxes of the Obama presidency, which is, I wrote this book because there have been a lot of surprises in the presidency. And one of the biggest surprises has been that the president has adopted techniques that he certainly didn't talk about during the campaign and certainly don't sound like engagement. Now, he's done the engagement as well. And his view has been, in the Iran case, for example, that you can't do engagement alone. You have to do engagement and pressure. The part of the pressure they talk about is sanctions. The part they don't talk about is the cyber side and other sabotage acts. In the case of Pakistan, it's particularly potent. I mean, just think of this contrast. The United States often says that we don't want to just be dealing with the Pakistani military. We want to deal with a democratically elected Pakistani government and try to encourage a culture of democracy. Well, the democratically elected Pakistani parliament, about, a month and a half ago, passed a resolution quite overwhelmingly to ban foreign drone strikes in their territory. And just by count, it appears that the United States has continued and by some count increased the pressure of drone strikes in recent weeks and months. So reconciling those two, trying to keep the pressure on while they are also trying the engagement track is, I think, one of the fascinating balancing acts. And if it works, if this mix of pressure and diplomacy works, then President Obama, I think, will be able to say that he cut a new way in American foreign policy. If instead it creates as many resentments as it achieves successes, then you've got a much more difficult measurement.
Mike, right there.
Yes, my question has to do with the cyber part of your presentation. My name? Well, I'm Dr. Will Curtis from the U.S. Naval Academy. I'm wondering about the use of cyber threats and so forth as an instrument of statecraft. It seems to me that the Russians use that quite successfully in their near abroad.
This is a growing reality for all of us. All sophisticated countries are developing cyber tools of some type, both for defense but also for offense. Overwhelmingly, it's cyber espionage. I mean, I think that's overwhelmingly the activity that's underway by state organizations. You know, it's like all forms of new technology. Man has this capacity to find ways to use them, you know, coercively, and everybody is working on it. Everybody's trying to find a way to do it. So I think we are right to be thinking our way through it. We are trying to do it in a manner that's consistent with a democracy and a rule of law. I have no doubt that they went through legal reviews when they were deciding. I'm not confirming what you wrote. I just, but I have no doubt that they went through a process, just as we do with a kinetic weapon, with a weapon that blows things up. I have no doubt that we went through a legal review to assure ourselves that the president was authorized to do this and that it was appropriate. And all countries are now trying to develop these tools, and we really do have to develop. It doesn't mean we can't cooperate on trying to create a regime where we can minimize the risk posed by cyber. I'll just give you an example. I mean, we and the Chinese share an interest in not letting a third country get us into a war with each other. We certainly have an interest in not letting a criminal organization disrupt their financial system or our financial system. We each have an interest in not letting a terrorist organization use machines in their country against us and vice versa. So there are still going to be patterns of cooperation that I think we can and will be developing with cyber at the same time that we're going to be developing for unilateral use if we have to.
All right. One more question.
Can I just
Yeah, sure.
throw something very quickly in on that? This is why it's important to begin a debate in this country about whether or not this is the kind of weapon we want to be using and under what rules. And I think clearly we're going to end up having to use cyber weapons just as we've had to use many other weapons along the way. It took us, 20 years before we came up with a set of real rules about nuclear weapons. When you think that General MacArthur was thinking about using nuclear weapons in Korea, there was discussion during the Cuban Missile Crisis 50 years ago this October about using nuclear weapons then. And so it took about 20 years. There's been a debate for 10 or 11 years now about the right rules about drones, and we're really still having that argument to this day. So I think there's no reason to believe it's going to be a very easy argument on cyber, because in the case of nuclear, we've decided we're almost never going to use them unless the survival of the state is at stake. In the case of drones, we've decided we're going to use them just about every week because there's something of a precision weapon when we need to. And cyber is somewhere in between. And the rules that you develop for nuclear and for drones don't always fit in cyber very easily.
All right, this lady.
Hi, thank you. Jamie Morgan with the Economist Intelligence Unit. Can you talk a little bit about the debate process that went on within the administration in deciding how in terms of the whole drone process, in terms of deciding to centralize that decision-making process at the NSC, and it seems to be an administration where the president considers moral, legal, and efficiency issues. You've talked about that balance, and just shed a little bit of light on the rationale that went into that decision.
That's probably a good question for both of us. In the case of drones, as in cyber, I've been struck by the fact that you sort of see the two sides of President Obama here. The constitutional lawyer who is very interested in limiting the way these weapons are used. In cyber, he was constantly asking the question, is there collateral damage that could happen? Are we sure we're not turning off the electricity to hospitals? Is this as narrowly directed at the Iranian nuclear program as it can be? In drones, you see a similar issue, I think, as they try to narrow the list and then ask this very hard question. If you have attacked the top level of the Al-Qaeda leadership or some other set of targets, and then the next level comes up, at what point do you stop using this weapon? Do you come to the conclusion that the people who are coming up may not be as direct a threat to the United States? And that's been a very complex set of arguments, and I think what we learned from that terrific piece that Scott Shane and Joe Becker did, and from Mr. Kleidman's book as well, is that debate about where you draw the line is so complex that the president has wanted to get involved in it himself directly.
What we don't realize is these drone attacks require a very large ground infrastructure, because you've got to know exactly when the guy's getting in the car and when he's leaving and what the car is. It takes a lot of operational infrastructure to make these work, and that entails considerable risk to the country. So it is appropriate that the president is involved in these decisions, because every one of them does entail the considerable reputational and operational risk facing the country. So I wouldn't see, some people are trying to say, well, this is a president that micromanages war. This is quite different, and because of the nature of what it takes to be successful in this area, he has to be involved.
All right, well, that has to be our last question for TCU and CSIS. Thank you all. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you.